Good day, everybody. Randy Franklin Smith here, and today we're talking about how to detect lateral movement with some really cool new events in Windows Server 2016. And for the record, I'll repeat this a couple other times, these events also occur in Windows 10. These are great events because if you are capturing logs from your workstations, which is so important nowadays, these events were designed by Microsoft specifically for the purpose of catching a bad guy who has embedded on somebody's PC and is looking around and trying to collect accounts and credentials and then move on to other systems. So we get from the PC of the HR rep to somebody else's PC, to somebody else's, to a server, and then from that server to other servers. These events are going to be triggered when somebody's trying to do that, and I'll show you why and how that works. I have with me here today Seth Goldhammer from Logarithm. Seth is the Senior Director of Product Management, and Seth, thanks for making today's Real Training for Free possible.
Absolutely, appreciate it. Thanks for having us, Randy, and appreciate having time with everyone on the webinar today.
And folks, please give us your questions, and I'll try to work them in as much as I can today. Let's see here. So let me give you a little bit of an overview of what we'll be getting into. So like I said, these events are all about catching the bad guys earlier in the attack life cycle, and that's so important because, in fact, folks, I was just on the phone with Mandiant yesterday and the office out here on the West Coast, and we were both commiserating over the fallacy of high-value target vigilance on high-value targets. Of course, you want to watch your high-value targets, but what you're doing, Seth, if all you do is watch what's happening and try to detect intrusions to your high-value targets, then you are setting yourself up for late-stage attack detection. And you're confined, I should say, you are confining yourself to late-stage attack detection. Whereas if we can catch bad guys when they first embed and start moving around, they haven't even gotten into anybody's quote-unquote high-value system, then we're way ahead of the game. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. We've seen that there's a pretty proven, kill chain, attack life cycle. There's different names there, and what I think you're suggesting is, we want to look for not just later stage activities that are now indicative of the threat's already emerged, it's already prevalent. Can we actually recognize indicators of the emerging threat as it's happening to put you in a position to actually take action prior to that assailant, taking data, disrupting the network, et cetera?
Yeah, damage before damage occurs. Exactly. Yeah, it's like having an early warning system, like right out at your periphery. I mean, there's all kinds of metaphors we could use, but it's catching it earlier. Earlier is better. And, the other point that I love the guys that they made was that the user's PC doesn't have to be a high-value server if the user himself or herself has access to the data. That's the other thing, but that's a whole other story. The point is we want to catch attacks sooner, and that's what today's webinar is all about. And these events give us a way to distinguish between the normal, we're going to call it noise, of a legitimate user going about her work compared to a bad guy. And that's something that's difficult classically, but this gets better with these just a few events. So let's talk about them then. What do attackers do? What do attackers do that normal users don't? So normal users don't normally look at other local groups on the system to enumerate their membership. So let's think about this. If I go into computer management, folks, every computer out there, whether it's a member server or a workstation, has local users and groups. Now, we have for a long time said, don't use local groups, use Active Directory groups. But for vigilance purposes, it can be very different. By the way, we're getting some keyboard noise from one of the panelists on the line, so please be aware of that. Maybe mute if you're not speaking. So here's our local groups. We may not use them much for legitimate purposes, but a bad guy, let's just imagine that my Surface PC here has been broken into through a phishing attack or drive-by download. Anyway, I've got bad guy code running, and it may be an exe, it may be PowerShell Empire running in memory, who knows. But the first thing the bad guy is going to do is he's going to say, okay, what groups are on this system, and which users are in these groups, because that's going to allow him to branch out possibly. Maybe this isn't the first PC or computer that he's broken into. Maybe he's spread to this computer, and now he is saying, okay, I don't have privileged access yet to the system, but I have collected 5 usernames and passwords so far. So are any of my user accounts that I've captured credentials of, are they members of any of the groups here on this system? Or which groups are important to me here? So when he opens up a group and looks at the members of that group, and now folks, I'm using computer management, Microsoft Management Console, right? But we could be using anything. The events that we talk about, whether you're using PowerShell or Windows APIs to enumerate the members of this group, these events are going to be triggered. So that's one example of what we're talking about. Now, another thing that happens is a user, a bad guy, is also going to want to know what groups do I belong to on this system. And so the same thing is going to be logged. If we have a local user account here and we look at that and we're like, perhaps this would be a useful account. We bring it up, we look at the members, that's going to trigger another one of these events. Now, can legitimate users do this? They can, but how often do users do this? How often do applications do this? Not a lot, and I can tell you because I've been watching these events. Now, there are false positives, and we're going to talk about how to account for those as we go along here. Also, another important thing is looking at process lineage. By that I mean, what program, when we see a program run, it's useful to know what program started that program. Because, for instance, Bob running PowerShell, that's one thing. But if we see PowerShell started from the start menu, okay, we might still be interested depending on what kind of user Bob is. But if we see something like this, where, who do I want to use? Yeah, Internet Explorer started PowerShell. Okay, now I'm starting to get nervous. Now, in the old days, that was pretty difficult to do because we would have to correlate multiple process start events by their process ID, and so that's a lot of work. That has improved, not with a new event, but just a few new key fields on one of our familiar events. Let me just look at my questions real quick here, and I want to keep up with anybody keeping track with us. By the way, please use the question window for any and all feedback that you want to share, and we'll work as much of that in as we can as we're going here. So these are the scenarios then that we're discussing. Let's dive into the first one. All right, so a new event from Microsoft beginning in Windows 10, and it's also now here in Windows 2016 Server, and that is event ID 4798. A user's local group membership was enumerated. And here's the key, here's the cool thing. What it's going to do is it shows you who did it and what user was impacted. So what do we see here? I am logged on to my PC in this event with my Azure AD account. That's a new thing you can do in Windows 10 and 2016. So that's who did it. What I did was open up the administrator group and see, or not the administrator group, the administrator user account on this local computer, and asked, what groups does this user belong to? What program did I use to do that? MMC. So this looks fairly innocuous. We might wonder why Randy was doing that, but he did it with MMC. Now, it's not to say that a bad guy couldn't use MMC, but Seth, likely the bad guy's going to do that more with a PowerShell command or just running the straight Windows API, depending on what kind of rat tool he's got on the system that he's embedded with.
Yeah, I would suspect so. They're generally not using the GUI.
That's right. That's right. I mean, there's plenty of rat tools that allow them to, but they want to stay underneath the radar. They don't want to have Windows popping up on your screen. Now, before I do more with this event and show you how we might use it, let me show you the other event, which is 4799. So this is from the opposite, kind of the opposite point of view. This is where, well, let's just follow the story. So a local group membership was enumerated. First of all, who did it? Well, again, this is my Azure AD account, Randy Franklin Smith, and then what I did is I opened up the built-in users group and just checked out the membership. I again did this with MMC. But wouldn't it be cool if we were watching these events and it came along with something like, oh, I can't remember one of the popular rat tools out there, but how about this, PowerShell, something like that instead of MMC. How interesting that would be. And then there's more stuff that you can do. Like, do I want to tell you about it now or later? I think I'll save that here for a second, because right now I'm just focusing on the event IDs themselves and how they work. And I'm going to get through the rest of those events, and then we're going to talk about practical ways to put them to use. Okay, so those are the two new events for catching when somebody is casing out your system, finding out what other users and groups are on that system, what they have access to. And I just want to make sure that that is clear to everybody, that is that is classic behavior of a bad guy, because the whole thing of extending your horizontal kill chain is we start with a system that doesn't matter and a user that doesn't matter. But we look at who has logged on to this system. If a privileged user in the past has logged on to this first system that we're starting with, maybe we've come in somehow from the internet, drive-by download or whatever. Lots of times if a administrator has logged on to the system in the past, then there's still credential artifacts there that then allow us to break into maybe a couple other systems. And then if there's credential artifacts here with stuff like pass the hash or other cache credentials, saved passwords, all this kinds of stuff that we've talked about in other webinars, that's going to allow the user to grab even more systems. And of course, I'm not even showing the user accounts here. But in each case, when we get in, we want to look at the local user accounts and the local groups to help us direct our activities as the bad guy, and that's what we're catching here. So super useful stuff. Let me see if I can take a couple questions here. Doran says, do we need both 4798 and 99? Same information? No. Well, no, because one is telling you when we open up a local user account, what groups is this user member of? The other is, okay, here's a local group. Who is a member of this local group? So that's the difference between those two, Dora. Let's see here. PowerShell. Okay, great. So let's now move on and talk about process start events. Now, the first thing I want to point out, folks, let's say we've got a really sophisticated attacker who is trying to live off the land, maybe using something like PowerShell Empire. Okay, so that's not going to produce a process start event necessarily, because there's ways that we can, like with a macro, kick things all off inside of Microsoft Office, like Word, and never even touch the disk, not start a process for our RAT itself, because we're living off the land and we're also doing it completely script-based. But sooner or later, you are going to run some kind of exe. Whether it's a bad guy exe or just a legitimate exe. And the point is, and we've talked about this in other webinars, is to look at the lineage of that process. Now, in the old days, we would have had to get 4688. We'd have to get the 4688 that says, and I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to use PowerShell because it's one that comes to my mind quickly. And we would get the creator process ID off of that event. So we'd get the creator process ID off of that event. Then we'd go back in time looking through the log, looking for another 4688 where its PID process ID was the creator process ID down here from the first occurrence of 4688. And at that point then, we would have the process name of, whatever program started PowerShell. Now, that lineage is so important, and I think I've described it already in this webinar, because you're going to see some really odd things. Seth, if you see Microsoft Word or Acrobat or Internet Explorer starting up administrative programs, that's like a smoking gun. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely, and that's exactly what a lot of these RAT tools do. Is they're trying to hide under legitimate applications, so they it doesn't provide that appearance that something is running amok on a system. So you're exactly right to be looking for that kind of an application that has child processes that just doesn't seem right.
Yeah, and I guess maybe the thing I left out here or assumed we would be thinking about is, so let's say I have Word or another totally end user program, Internet Explorer running here, Chrome. What the bad guys have done is through a buffer overflow or a macro or whatever, they've embedded and ultimately they've loaded up their own DLL, typically inside the memory of the system. Well, I shouldn't even call it a DLL because that implies that they got it off disk. But they have their own thread going with their own code loaded into memory of this process. So it's like a zombie process. Word doesn't know that it's doing this, but it is. But once this thing goes out and starts another process, then we look at the name of the process that started it, the name of the process that got started, and say, does that make sense? And it used to be so hard because you had to tie together the two 4688s. Now you don't, simply because they added this one little field. Now we get, and this is a lame example that I pasted in here because it's just search filter host, but what this is telling us, the story is telling us, is that searchindexer.exe started searchfilter.exe. So in the situation we're talking about, you would see, what is it, iexplore.exe running PowerShell, or cscript. That's another good one. .exe. Awesome. All the alarms should be going off. And by the way, folks, just want to stress, I always do when I talk about PowerShell, is that there's some really great audit logging capabilities for PowerShell itself, but we're not going to talk more about that today. It's something you can look at later. Let's see here. So yeah, so let me check my questions, see if anybody's got any on that one. It's so valuable, the stuff that they've added. I wish that they added more stuff to the security log on a regular basis. Let's see here. Yeah, so Bobby, to clarify, is this only implemented on 2016 and Windows 10 machines? Yeah, these events and these new fields that you saw right there on 4688 are only available on the latest versions of Windows, yes. Okay, and Ulysses asks, what would be a Windows event that Mimikatz would spawn? So that depends on, what version of Mimikatz you're using. There's no, there definitely may be an exe associated with Mimikatz, but I'm seeing it more and more used just through reflective memory attacks, or for instance with PowerShell Empire, they have completely implemented Mimikatz inside PowerShell. So what you're going to see more is not evidence of Mimikatz itself running, but you're going to see strange examples of user accounts being used for the first time on another PC, or another key thing is a privileged user logging on to a PC that they shouldn't normally be logging on to if we're practicing good hygiene. And I've got an event coming up to help you with that. Okay. Oh, that would be cool. Lucas has a great question here. Is there something similar to these new fields for alternate data streams? That would be so cool as a way to, let me explain what I think Lucas is getting at is NTFS file system has a little used feature called alternate data streams, where it's like being able to store multiple files within one file is the easiest way to explain it, unless you are familiar with Stream.io. And it's a great way to hide bad guy data. But no, I'm not aware of any events that are specific to alternate data streams. And the reason that is a good idea, Lucas, and this is probably what you're thinking already, is not a lot of good guys use alternate data streams, but the bad guys do. Okay, so I'm going to move on here. And let's talk about when we're further into the attack life cycle. So this then means that as we get deeper in, we've collected more and more credentials. We've gained access to more and more systems. And so this is going to sooner or later result in a privileged account being captured. And then here's the point. The privileged account being used on a system that you wouldn't normally see it on. So let's say we have a good rule in place that says AD admins should only be logging on to privileged access workstations, or they're called PAWs. Okay, well, somewhere along the line, the bad guy has stolen one of these privileged accounts, and he uses that account to log on to some system to gain information, to download info from that computer itself, or just to continue pushing out his kill chain. All right, so if we have a way of recognizing privileged user accounts when they log on, and if we can also differentiate between systems that are at that level of security and systems that are not at that level of security. So, whatever level, let's say this is a tiers, that they should be only logging on to tier 0 privileged access workstations. If we see Bob_admin logging on to a non-tier 0 system, then bam, all the alarms should go off. Now, I've presented different ways to do that in the past, where basically, Seth, we would have to keep up a static list of all of our privileged users. And, like with your solution, with Logarithm, it's possible to maintain lists and even automate it to a degree, right? But it's work, and that's the thing. Whereas we're going to show you an event that simplifies that to a degree, and that is 4627. But you know what I'm talking about, lists and the capability you have that in Logarithm, right? We could build a list of privileged users in Logarithm and compare that with alarms and so on, right? When we see events and when we see that username.
Yeah, that's right. There's a couple different ways to do that. Certainly we could learn from Active Directory, but that's going to give you the groups as defined in Active Directory. So sometimes we want to be, sometimes that's not necessarily indicative of who actually has access to particular systems, and that's where we want to learn, who are all the users who are accessing the system or are running processes on the system. And so we have an ability to build out that list. Since we're seeing all those logs, we could just pick out, hey, here are all the users who have accessed this system within the last 7 days, and now begin to recognize when new users outside of that learned list begin popping up.
That's true. So whenever you see a logon event to the PAW, you could conclude from that that user, Bob, is a privileged user, and so he goes on to your privileged user list in Logarithm, and then that list is checked against from other alarm rules when you see Bob logging on, or any user logging on to some other system, right? So that's one of the, yeah, and so that's one of the scenarios, and it certainly works, but check out how 4627 changes the story, at least for Windows accounts. So here's the new event, and as long as we have turned on this new category, so there's a new audit category in Windows called Audit Group Membership. We need that turned on, and we also need Audit Logon turned on in order to get this event. Okay, so 4627, what does it tell us? It gets logged when you log in. So this event and 4624, basically a one-to-one correspondency, I would say. But this is so cool. This is telling us that Randy Smith, with his Azure AD account, logged in. I logged on interactively to this computer. That's what logon type 2 means. And who did I log in as? I logged on as administrator, and look at this. It's saying when I logged in, here are all the groups that I was a member of, and this is just beautiful. If we keep going, we also get the Active Directory groups. So all the groups you're seeing here at the beginning are local groups on that system. But let me go over to my event log encyclopedia. And how dare you forget my domain name. And let's go to event ID 4627. I think I've got a larger example there. Okay, we cut off some of it. But the point is, this is going to show me all the groups to which I belong. Yeah, on this particular system, this computer is not a member of a domain, and that's why you're not seeing the rest of that. But we would have that there. Now, why is this so powerful? Well, let's say like if I was a domain admin, that's going to show up here. Even if I'm not directly a member of that domain admin. That's the other important thing, Seth, is this is coming from my access token, which takes into account nested groups. Your access token has resolved all that nested group stuff, and so we're going to see a nice flattened list of all the groups that I belong to. So we could certainly then, just out of the box, create a rule that says if you're a member of schema admins, enterprise admins, domain admins, or account operators, then we know that a highly privileged user has logged on. Now all we need to know is the computer he or she logged on to an appropriate system? Is it a tier 0 safe system for logging on with that type of account? Or there could be other rules. So how do we do that? Well, part of that would come down, I would say, Seth, to the naming convention of your computer names. Like with logarithm, you could certainly create a rule that says if the computer name does not begin with PAW- or something like that, right? If we set our naming convention for privileged access workstations as PAW-, then we would just say if anybody who's a member of domain admins, or if we see 4627 with one of those privileged groups and the computer name right here doesn't begin with PAW, then bam, set off an alarm. You follow me?
Yeah. Certainly that would be one way to identify that pretty quickly. In terms of whether it's a naming convention of the computers or not, one of the things we did at Logarithm, we have this construct we call entities, where we could define different networks or hosts within those networks, and you can actually set the threat rating on those hosts, and that gives you the ability to do a couple things. One, it allows you to, we could learn, what are all the hosts in a particular network, and allow for, instead of using a naming convention, we could just be using that group of hosts, within a particular network segment, as an example. And because we have a different threat rating that is aligned to that network or to those hosts, then when those activities do take place, we can change the risk scoring that we've associated to that activity.
Yeah, absolutely. Tony says, with 4627, you're still talking about maintaining a list. He says, but now it's maintained in AD. Well, Tony, part of what I'm saying is we know the groups in Active Directory that ultimately have the authority, and once you add those in, whether you call it a list or not, it doesn't have to be maintained. Now, the other thing is, I wouldn't stop with that. I would go ahead and add other groups that I had created myself that may not be a member of any of those, that you've delegated important authority to. But again, that should be quite static. It's nowhere as dynamic as what the kind of list we were talking about before, where you're trying to keep track of all the users that are privileged. And that's all because of the nested group membership that complicates that, for instance, plus users come and go. See, we're taking that all away and just saying, hey, if you see anybody logging on anywhere who's a member of this group, bam, we've got it with 4627. And let me just scan through a couple of these other questions. No, I don't think Microsoft is going to backport this stuff, Ralph, to older versions of Windows. You can get command line options if you apply a patch. Well, if you get the command line options on 4688, Ralph, then you may be getting this because they both were at the same time, I think. So that would be really cool. I'll have to look at that. Let's see here. Tony, 4627, how is it different from protected users and groups monitoring? It all depends on the degree to which you've implemented protected users and groups, but that is something that would be good to dive down into in the future, is comparing those. Doran, what is the subject? Why is the subject account different than the new logon? Did you do it? Yeah, it was a run as, Doran, exactly. Or actually, Doran, I think I ran a something as administrator, with user access control, UAC. Steve, is there a corresponding event and details for the user's group membership at logoff? No, not at all. And user logoff is not a good thing to try to track. Very complex and doesn't work the way you would think it does in Windows. Trying to distinguish logon sessions, not a good thing to spend time on in Windows. Okay, cool. So this right here is just awesome, and there's a lot of other ways that we could slice and dice this too. Maybe we're not ready to set up alarms, Seth, because perhaps we don't have naming conventions and things as clearly cut. We don't have our environment locked down and good practices in place. What could we do? Well, you could set up a console that just shows newest computers with a privileged user logging on, right?
Yeah, so that's a good idea.
Yeah, we would see the latest computers, or we could see top computers and lowest. See, I always like to say not just top, Seth, I like to see, lowest or least. So show me the computers that have the fewest privileged users logging on, because that's likely an outlier and could be associated with a bad guy or somebody not following the rules. So
yeah, you're absolutely right. It's especially because hackers today, they don't want to be the top talkers. They're trying to be kind of low and slow, and so I think that's a really good point to bring up. Is that looking at the bottom, instead of the top 10, the bottom 10 in terms of activities actually might be more telling, because they are trying to do activities on the low, under the radar.
Yeah. Let's see here. So ways of using 4627, especially if you've implemented an in-tier, 1, 2, or 3 tier privileged account level, such as with Red Forest, then alert whenever a user in tier X logs on to a computer that's not in tier X. How do you identify the tier of your computer? All right, here's the thing. If you don't have a naming convention that makes that simple, then just create a static list of your high security workstations, and then say if the user is a member of one of these important groups and the computer they're logging on is not in this list, which would be pretty static, then let me know. Or alert whenever a tier 0 member logs on to a given system for the first time. I like the first time events too, because they allow us to see when changes occur and, jump on it then, and then the system just kind of gets used to it and moves on. But even if you haven't implemented this stuff, like the scenarios I was just talking about here with Seth, it still pays to watch these events. Know who your privileged groups are and be putting it up on a dashboard or a list somewhere whenever you see a member of one of those groups log on, or whenever you see 4627 with that group name in there, one of those group names. They've also added some nice information, by the way, to event ID 4624. In particular, I'll draw your attention here to restricted admin mode. In trying to combat pass the hash attacks, one of the best practices that has become common, or one of the features that's become commonly accepted best practice is when you remote desktop into a computer to use the restricted admin mode on that remote desktop session so that your credentials are not stored in such a way that pass the hash and Mimikatz can easily get a hold of them on that target system you're already RDPing into. So when we see logon type 10, then we would want to see restricted admin mode equal yes. So that's one thing that we could use for this, is we are seeing logon type, we're seeing remote desktop logons without restricted admin mode, and I'm assuming we're talking about admin logons. This would not apply necessarily to thin client systems or terminal services systems for end users, but when we see administrative logons. And by the way, elevated token is going to likely be yes in that case, although it depends upon your user account settings. That's another new field here well, we'll talk about it here in a little bit. You might have noticed, first of all, one of these other new fields, virtual account. So those are associated with services. You can now run services with the logon as user account on a service can just be the name of the service. And what that does is Windows creates something called a virtual account, doesn't really even create it, and runs that service under an account that is unique to just that service, and it provides you some isolation between different services on the same system. And so this is just telling you when that happens. I haven't identified scenarios yet where I want to use that from a security monitoring perspective, but it's interesting nevertheless. And it's good to see that they're keeping the events up to date with new features in Windows. There's also that new field there called linked logon ID, and this is filled in on logon types 7 and cached credentials. As I was saying earlier, I don't know if anybody caught it, but I was saying trying to audit logon sessions in Windows is extremely problematic. First of all, nobody logs out nowadays. That's the number one thing. You log on. When's the last time you logged out of your computer, Seth?
Oh yeah, never. In fact, when I was doing network access control product, that was one of the things we were looking for, is to understand when users logged out, and it was just an impossible task. It's very hard to track it, quite honestly.
Yeah. So and there's all kinds of reasons for it that I could talk about in a future webinar and have in the past. By the way, folks, if somebody is asking about past webinars, can you get the slides? You can get the whole webinar. Just go to my webinar library at ultimatewindowssecurity.com. You'll be able to find it very quickly, and you can watch just about any webinar I've done in the past. Okay, so how to use these? Well, with all these, you want to start out by baselining your normal activities. So with 4624, go into your log management solution, do a query on 4624 where elevated token equals yes, and then see what's actually happening. Draw some generalizations, and then create lists and dashboards, or maybe even alerts that that show you when you fall out of that normal usage scenario. You might want to alert, as I said, when admin users log on without restricted admin mode. That can either be a non-compliant admin who just isn't following the directions, or it could be a bad guy who doesn't know better, and we're talking about a late-stage attack at that point. I'm not going to spend time on that event today. It's a new event, 6416. It applies to when you plug in a USB device for the first time. Here's a question people ask me: how do I configure these new events? Some of them are new categories. On how can I use group policy to turn this stuff on Windows 10 and 2016 systems? Your domain controller does not need to be upgraded. You could just have one member server out there. You can still use group policy. You just need to edit the group policy object from one of these later versions of Windows. That's all you need to do. It won't affect your pre-Windows 10, pre-Windows 2016 systems. So the security log is 99.9% unchanged, but these new events are super useful, and you'll want to take advantage of them when you implement Windows 10 and Windows 2016. And Seth, should we try to show them some examples of how you might use these events with like something like Logarithm?
Yeah, let's do that.
All right, I'm going to make you the presenter.
All right, so what I've done is I've pulled up a search where essentially it was a pretty basic search. I'm just looking for the vendor message ID 4798, 4799. Those were two of the new Windows events that you were speaking to. And this is just displaying the events just in a dashboard format. One of the nice things about logarithms, we can always get to the underlying log data pretty quickly here as well. But just looking at the dashboard view, we already start to get some pretty interesting information. I'm sure you'll be able to extrapolate on this, Randy. But just looking at kind of the who was logged into the systems generating these events and when these events were generated. So we have that alignment of when these activities were taking place and spikes thereof. I think what you might be more interested in, as I kind of scroll down to the bottom, is starting getting into, well, what groups were they looking at? What were the process names that they were hiding? It's always nice when they call themselves the bad guy. That, of course, isn't always the case. But yeah, why don't you talk a little bit more about what this dashboard is presenting?
Yeah, so the first way that I would use this dashboard, and I mean, this is just basically a default analyzed dashboard, right? These are the default fields that it picks up and displays. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so I mean that first of all, that's just incredible, and the cool thing is, you guys didn't even have to know what 4798 and 4799 really mean, as long as you mapped the fields in that event to your common event taxonomy. Why then, for any event, we're going to be interested in what is the event's process name, what's its host, what's its, did it impact a user? If so, which user? Did it involve a group? And so, it's the way you normalize events, just you get the dividends from that over and over and over. It's the gift that keeps on giving, I guess you'd say, because what we immediately get here is if I'm interested in using these new events, 4798 and 4799, before I can start using them for threat hunting purposes, I need to know, what is happening in our environment that's legitimate and that is innocuous and it's harmless, that is triggering these events. And so right away we get to see, well, which groups are getting enumerated for whatever reason. And that pops up right there with our top groups. Now, this isn't going to be realistic because this is just my lab that I set up, but if, for instance, you have, let's say you've got an application that always needs to check, is a user a member of this local group in that application? Because you've got things like that. In fact, one of my applications creates a group in Windows, Seth, named after itself, and that's part of how we control authority, is just using a local Windows group. So we're checking the membership of that group all the time, right? And we would see this in that case, and we would know that, okay, whatever we do, we don't want to alert on that, and if we have some threat hunting dashboards, we'd want to filter that out and suppress it, right? So that's the first way we would use a simple analysis like this, is just to baseline. I mean, what would you call that, Seth? Baselining your normal system activity so that you can avoid false positives?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, kind of getting a level set of, what are those applications, legitimate applications that, because certainly these Windows events are generated for legitimate reasons, and so you're getting a baseline of that, and that's something that can be, from a machine perspective, we could baseline that. That's something you don't have to just eyeball it. We can essentially programmatically learn that and then start to look for offsets.
So, for instance, let's say privileged console access, which we probably would not want to get rid of that one, but since it's so big, it's throwing off our statistics. If we filtered that out, why then our stats are going to change immediately, right? So, I mean, that would be a matter of just going into your search and saying, exclude those, and then boom, all of our stats are just going to change.
Yeah, there's actually, we could do that here. I don't know if it makes sense to do it on the fly, but each of these widgets, you can essentially, put an aware clause. And so, if we wanted to say, but not this group, and store that, save that as part of this view, it would be very easy to do so. And of course, from a programmatic perspective, that's where we have the ability to learn that baseline, but you could always edit that baseline if you wanted to, add things to the whitelist or remove things from that whitelist.
Yeah, so I love it. I always love to see, how my visualizations change when I get rid of the noise, and now we start to develop a signal that has, much smaller and less frequent little blips, but the blip a lot more because we've gotten rid of this wide swath of noise that's bringing all of our averages and everything else down. But the next thing that we see, can we go back to just the larger view that's got all the groups?
Yeah, should be back now.
Okay, great. I just have a little bit of latency. See here. So the next thing we also see is who is doing this, because that may be the other thing. There may be a certain application that is going out and enumerating every group on every system, like a vulnerability analysis tool or a reporting tool that's just collecting information, and it's going to be tripping these events, and it's going to throw everything off. And so where we would see that under our top user origin, because in logarithm, you've got several columns. You've got user origin and user impacted, which I love. By the way, another sim I was working on totally confuses those. If it sees a username, it just sticks it in the user column. Whether the user, it was the who done it, or whether the user was who was this done to, and that's the difference of everything, right? So if we had an application that was doing that, let's just call it imaginary AD reporter, and there's probably a service account named after that, it's going to show up there. We could then filter that out and say, okay, now I've gotten rid of that. And the other thing is it would tell us what process. That's That's the other, and really the process is what I'm going to be interested in once I've gotten rid of the noise. The things that I'm going to be particularly keying in on is your host and your process name over here, because I'm going to want to know, oh wow, so a group got enumerated on this computer. All right, whose computer is that, or what server is that, and what program did it? Okay, it was MMC, and who did it? Oh, it was Bob the administrator, and yeah, that server is under his authority. So okay, that's all right, right? But on the other hand, weird. We see that Timothy Sutton ran this on such and such server using the command line. Okay, I'm interested in that. Why would Timothy ever be doing that? You know what I'm talking about, Seth?
Yeah, very quickly. You can see here, kind of as I'm going back and forth between the two process names. I can back out the crumbs here. So if I wanted to look at just who are those users and what groups were enumerated, using this particular process, it's pretty easy now to visualize that. So I can see that it was the administrators group that was enumerated using the service host process, and exactly what user accounts were responsible for doing that.
Now, Seth, is it reasonable that once I identify, okay, this was innocuous, if I've got the time, or especially if this happens more than once, then I should be thinking, all right, is there a good generalized way that I could suppress this from showing up and taking my time or another analyst's time in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the nice things about Logarithm is in our alarming, in our analytics, you could build an exceptions list. So this helps us with, you talked about your vulnerability management system. So we want to exclude those because we know that they're going to be a heavy user or a heavy generator of this activity. So you can apply that to that exceptions list, and now the alarming will avoid those, when those activities occur from those particular systems or from those particular users. So based on what those activities are, you can build out those exceptions lists either manually, and that could be just as easy as essentially clicking on, in this case, if I wanted to click on a host and then add it to a list, I have the ability here to go ahead and add two lists pretty easily. That would be the way, and we would choose the appropriate list for that to occur. So analysts can do that on the fly, and what that's doing is making your machine, it's essentially a supervised machine learning. It's making your machine learning that much smarter because now it knows to avoid those particular systems.
Because my goal with dashboards is to get it to where it's empty, like ideally empty, unless there's something I need to look at, or something, or it's all green unless there's something I need to look at. Now, you can't do that in every situation, and certainly there's other situations where we just can't make that great of a judgment, but I would just like to see, what are the latest systems in the past 24 hours where we've seen this event for the first time. And a lot of times it's just your eye sweeping the dashboard. It really depends on what kind of security operation you have as well, right? Because I'm sure, for instance, my company, Seth, we don't have a 24-hour SOC who has eyes on the dashboard. So we are going to rely on alerts a lot. And speaking of which, how about this, folks? With this 4799, 4798 event, why don't we go out to our systems? We could do this so easily and create a honey group. We just create a local group on systems. It's not going to impact or break anything. Let's create a new group called privileged console access, or something just generic, system access, something like that. And then, we're not even going to put any members in it, Seth. We're just going to wait for someone to look in that group. That's when we could set up an alarm for something like that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It would be very easy to create, hey, the group is your honey group, I think as you were calling it, Randy, and then, whatever appropriate events, so we're, in this case, we're now looking for, did any user enumerate this group, knowing that this group isn't associated to any application, there's just no legitimate business reason anyone would touch this group. And this will give us, that immediate visibility. So I did this as a search, but very easy to run this as an alarm, as a real-time alarm as well. So anytime those activities occurred with, kind of this basic correlation, we'd be able to recognize that, spotlight that, and bring it up in attention.
Yeah. Now, John has a question for you. What data is Logarithm capturing? Is it just event logs, or is there a client reporting in? Do you mind if I answer this one, to take a shot at answering it, Seth?
Yeah, please go ahead.
I mean, it's up to you. You can put the Logarithm, if you want to call it agent, it's called a system monitor, on that system, and it can get more than just event logs. You've got a number of things that can only be monitored if there's actual bits running on the target system. Basically host intrusion detection stuff. But you can also collect events remotely, or a lot of my folks attended my webinar recently on Windows Event Collection, Windows Event Forwarding, Seth, and you do a great job of consuming forwarded events as well. So there's like 3 different ways you can get these logs into Logarithm, whether you put a system monitor right there on that system, or whether you collect them remotely, or whether you consume forwarded events. Seth?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And maybe to add to what you said, and hopefully address the question that was asked. So we can collect Windows events, as Randy talked about it, in many different ways. Remotely, forwarded events, etc. It's not just Windows events. Logarithm has the ability to collect really anything, whether that's flash files or database rows, records. So any way that there might be data that's being generated by not just the system, but even applications running on that system, we can collect that data. Randy also mentioned our system monitor that does have its own endpoint monitoring activities. So in the cases where you may not have the auditing enabled on a workstation, but you still want to get visibility to what processes were running, what network connections were opened, we can independently capture that information without having to turn Windows advanced auditing on that system, which can sometimes be expensive from a resource perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's see, alerts. So yeah, I mean, I think we've shown them a few of the ways that we could use some of these new events in Logarithm, whether it's an alert. And with building the alerts, Seth, one thing I like, I don't know if you can show it, but it's not a bunch of ugly JSON or scripting or rules or whatever. It's pretty graphical, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So if you wanted to take this, the search we ran, the privilege console access and the vendor message ID, we have our analytics engine, we call it AI engine, and this is where you have the ability to build out advanced correlations or even get into behavioral analysis. We talked about some of the whitelisting, learned whitelisting, and even doing statistical analysis on activities. We created a pretty simple rule. As Randy said, here's the GUI for creating a rule. In this case, we didn't even link multiple activities because it's really just a single activity that we're looking for. These are different rule blocks that we can stitch together if we're starting to look for a more advanced type of scenario. And I really do think of this as not as rules, but really scenarios. What are particular scenarios I may be concerned if I would be concerned should they occur within my environment. In this particular example, we use a log observe. So I'm just looking for, do I have logs that indicate, and in this case, we have really just a standard kind of Boolean logic. The group is privileged console access. the vendor message ID was, and there was a list of vendor message IDs. So this is a pretty straightforward correlation that is involved in just a single rule block, which is this log observed. What's interesting about logarithm is you have these multiple rule blocks to choose from, such as not observed. Perhaps I saw a Windows event ID, but I did not see this particular user or this particular group. So that's where you can start to build that that list of privileged users. So if I see someone outside of my privileged list is involved in this one of these activities, that could also be interesting. So the lack of information or the lack of an activity could also be interesting. And you have different types of rule blocks. Again, you can kind of stitch these together to help build the appropriate scenario for what is it that you're concerned with. And we certainly provide many, I would say hundreds of these scenarios out of the box for you to choose from. So it's not that you need to go and create these all from scratch.
Yeah. Let's see here. Somebody was asking me a question about 4782. So that's, strictly speaking, Ulysses, that's outside the scope of my webinar. But I'm going to bring it up because I would love to know, folks, if you're getting 4782 events, please let me know and let me know what the context is, because we haven't seen those much, at least back when I first researched it. If you're wondering, probably everybody's wondering, what is 4782? It says a password hash was accessed, but that's not going to help you catch necessarily past the hash attacks. The bad guys, Mimikatz and whatnot, are getting those password hashes from somewhere else than the SAM. So it's probably never going to be that useful of an event. Jason says, I'm curious, why do you say that trying to determine the length of a logon session when a user logged off and when they logged on, when they logged off is not a good idea in Windows? Okay, let me see if I can give a brief synopsis. Number one, users don't log off, Jason. They stay logged on. They just close their laptop or they walk away from their desktop and it locks. And this can go on for weeks and weeks at a time. So then what it ends up that you have to do is really it becomes not about the session. It becomes when were they physically present in front of the computer. And to figure that out, there's a whole slew of events that you have to correlate. You see the initial logon, then you see that the workstation locked or the screensaver kicked in, or if it's remote desktop. You see, even remote desktop sessions are not nice and discreet. People disconnect from the remote desktop session, it keeps running in the background, and then they reconnect. And so there's a whole bunch of events that play into this, and they're not always correlatable until lately with that linked logon ID field that they added to 4624. And so I even was almost called as a expert witness on a class action lawsuit where a lot of the evidence, believe it or not, was logon IDs, and it's so complicated to interpret them that they're going to have me come and testify as to how to, did the claimants really, actually I was working for the defense, did they actually interpret the logs correctly to show that people were or were not physically present. So I hope that helps you. There's a lot more to it than that, and I've got some webinars in the library that touch on that. Let's see here. Okay, now the cool thing is you've got some fairly recent functionality added to Logarithm, Seth, that ties in well to our overarching subject today, which is catching people at various stages of the life cycle, right? Whether it's these new events in Windows security or in Windows 2016 and 10 or not. You want to talk about that some?
Yeah, thanks, Rennie. Appreciate that. Yeah, you brought it up very early in your webinar that there is a pretty prescribed attack life cycle, and it's something that, as a result, as analysts, we can take advantage of this by recognizing those activities in what stage they may fall into in that attack life cycle, and that's something that our labs team took to heart. What they actually did is in those scenario-based rules that we were talking about earlier, those the ability to recognize different activities, our labs team actually mapped those out to when they would likely occur within this attack life cycle. So this is just an example of the types of scenarios that we would go and look for with our product. And what it does is it gives us the ability to now recognize the progression. So we can actually start to see that, hey, the same user or the user on the same system is involved in activities that, and this might be, sometimes this might be minutes apart. These could be days apart or weeks apart. And that becomes the real challenge here, is when you start to connect these dots that are of activities that might be across different systems at different points in time. And so it's very difficult for a human to create that connection, so let the machine do it, essentially. And that's where our machine-based analytics is really strong, is in helping to connect these dots, and now connecting those dots in a way that now is in recognition of where do we think we are in this attack life cycle. So we have the ability to more prescriptively understand that we're in an emerging threat in our environment, hopefully, well before it's getting to the latter stages of these activities. And of course, we're representing that through our risk scoring. So as we're seeing, individual activities, they're going to receive a risk score. But when we see groups of activities, especially groups of activities now in recognition of progression, we're going to represent that with higher and higher risk scores to really get your attention and help you prioritize your time, because we know that this isn't the only part of your day job that you guys are doing. So let me kind of show that a little bit here very quickly. So going back to the same UI that you've been looking at, this is just the alarms tab. We didn't get to the alarms tab previously, and just showing some kind of examples there where we have individual alarms that are fired. Of course, there's hundreds of activities that are being captured by the system, and this is what that progression alarm would start to look at, where we could actually start to see that there are activities with some commonality, that it's the same user, the same the same system that is being leveraged as it's moving to later stages of that attack lifecycle. And of course, the risk score. This alarm page is being sorted by risk. Of course, that risk score is increasing as we see that progression. With logarithm, what's helpful is that I do have the ability to get to just the immediate set of information. What helped generate this information, so I can immediately kind of get to those activities by pulling that up. By running what we call a drill down, I don't have to run kind of manual searches to get to that underlying data. I can very quickly get to what were the types of activities, the systems that were involved, et cetera, that occurred here, so that we can understand, in this case, lots of activities where a user is accessing a system we would not normally anticipate that user accessing, as well as we're seeing activities including that initial progression to lateral movement, where we saw the beaconing of activities from malware, et cetera. So this gives us an ability to understand kind of where we are, the priority of where we are, so that we can prioritize our time very quickly across that attack lifecycle. The other thing we've done that I'll show just kind of very quickly here is the ability to just get more contextual information about these activities to help me understand that. And I have to kind of back up to do that. Let me just go back to the dashboard, for example. If I was seeing activities on the dashboard that might be interesting, we talked about maybe looking at the top or the bottom, activities. That's very easy to do here. Kind of look at top or bottom list. Perhaps if there are users here, I don't know, I don't know Sheila from Adam, right? If I even in a company of a couple hundred people, it's pretty easy to no longer know everyone by name. And so this is where we just wanted to ensure that all that relevant information sort of at your fingertips. So we have this concept, we call it the inspector, and I can click on anything. If I click on a host, I'm going to get information about that host. In this case, let's get information about that user. Where in this case, we've actually gone back to our domain controller, pulled back information about Sheila from Active Directories, from the domain information we have. So we actually can see what department she's in. I can, if I'm worried that I'm seeing this account authenticated in multiple locations, I can maybe just give her a call and understand, hey, are you traveling right now? Or if you're sitting at your desk, then I'm going to be pretty concerned. So it's having that quick access to information. Sometimes the information you want isn't an integration like into an internal system like Active Directory. To give you an example, if I wanted to look up Sheila in a website like Have I Been Pwned, because I'm worried that again the activity that I'm seeing may be indicative that this is a compromised account. I could pull in information from what I've selected here. Maybe I want to look at, since I want to look at all the Sheilas in the world, I'm going to add in our email address and now run that, essentially pass her credential over to Have I Been Pwned to see, are other websites, have there been other compromises where Sheila has used her account and that's been compromised? So maybe from LinkedIn, from Home Depot, et cetera. So thankfully, she hasn't used her work email in anything that's been involved, that's been compromised, that Have I Been Pwned knows about.
Hey, I want to ask you a couple questions from folks here, Seth.
Yeah, please do.
First of all, Timothy, I think he's a logarithm user. Do you need to download a new KB set of rules to take advantage of these progression AIE alerts?
Yeah, really good question. All those are in our user threat detection module. So if you're a logarithm user, you know that we've broken out all of the different scenario-based analytics we have into separate modules, and that allows customers to self-identify. Okay, this module aligns to what I'm trying to use logarithm for. So instead of getting kind of the full list of reports, the full list of analytics, with everything you want and everything you don't want, you can self-select those that are of interest. Those progression rules all fall in our user threat detection module. So if you enable that module, you'll get access to those progression rules.
John asks, does logarithm have an ability to tell if a user's physically present with a full monitoring agent? And I think your system monitor, I think I saw something about logon tracking in the system monitor.
Yeah, there is user monitoring. So yeah, we are looking at, as we see processes, that is running at the kernel level. So we are recognizing the user that actually generated the commands to run that process. So that does get associated, as well as with real-time, with file integrity monitoring. That's running at the kernel level. So as users are interacting with the file system, touching files, moving files, we collect the user information at that point in time as well. So yeah, we do attribute activities to users with and at running at the kernel level. We have the ability to make that connection.
And we could definitely get in there and be able to determine, does it look like the user was physically present at a given time? Or if you're trying to figure out how, over the course of 24 hours, how long was the user there in front of that computer, there's ways we could figure that out.
Yeah, there's some pretty advanced technologies now that even look at, the keyboard typing, and will even try to do fingerprinting. Hey, Sheila normally kind of types in this way, and I'm seeing a user as Sheila, but typing in a very different way. That is not something Logarithm does. There's some very neat technologies out there that will certainly leverage their activity. We'll collect the logs from those but that is not something that we're developing into.
But Gad, it's really, and Seth too. I mean, it's really just also just using the events. We can see we have to kind of start with the log on ID. Okay, Bob logged on, log on type 2 to his workstation. How much, and then what we do is we look for either a log off or a workstation locked or screensaver kicked in event, or system went into suspend mode. And once one of those happens, we say, okay, he wasn't using the computer anymore. Then we wait for, okay, when does the workstation get unlocked? When does it screensaver dismissed or the computer come back on, and then screensaver dismissed, whatever. And okay, the user is back there. So maybe we'll do a webinar on that one of these days. You know what I would really like to know, this comes up all the time, but one thing I haven't gotten from people is why. What are they trying to figure out? Are they trying to figure out, was a bad guy program doing this, or was a user in front of the computer doing it? Because it would show up as the same user, potentially, Seth. You know, the bad guy program could very well be running as the user, even in their logon type 2 scenario, logon session. Or is it more about, you know, was the user at work? Are they reporting their time correctly? That's what I would like to understand. What, you know, what's the actual scenario? What are we trying to do? John also asked. Go ahead, Seth.
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe as people are typing in their thoughts on that, you know, what I've heard from customers is, yeah, they're concerned about user imposters. So someone has received Sheila's credentials and is now using that inappropriately, whether that's a privileged user abuse or that's actually an outside user imposter. One of the things that I think has been interesting, I've seen customers do, is correlate physical security to network security. Meaning they're looking at, did I see Sheila badge in that morning and then log in, or did I see a login without Sheila badging in? Because then I know that there's some sort of impropriety going on. So that kind of connection of physical security to network security, I personally find very interesting, and we have some customers doing some pretty interesting kind of scenarios that they're looking for, especially in very secure environments, where that badging in becomes very important. You know, for example, if I didn't see someone badge into a secure area, but the motion camera, just triggered, that could be very concerning. So for a high secure environment. So just some ideas for some food for thought for those that are listening.
That's good. Gad also says, out of the box, does Logarithm give you all this threat detection automatically, or do you have to define, pre-configure, and set it up first? And let me go on record. No, they have built this in. They have one of the things I've always admired about you guys, and it goes back to Chris Peterson, I think, is a heavy commitment to what am I trying to say? Knowledge engineering. In fact, didn't you call it that at one time? Now it's the labs department. But
yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
I mean, Logarithm has a common event taxonomy. Maybe you call it something different, but basically, a logon event is a logon event is a logon event, regardless of whether it came from Linux or Windows or a website or a router. You recognize all login events as the same. They all have the same attributes: the user who logged in, what host they logged into, what IP address they were at, what IP address they logged into, all that stuff. And so you're able to leverage that over and over again. So if you create one rule that says, we want to know when Alice logs on but has not badged in, then that's going to work regardless of what she is logging on to.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Phil Villela, Dr. Phil Villela, one of our founders with Chris, yeah, he was very, he recognized from his career in data science that, garbage in is garbage out. And so we very much wanted and very intently created a pretty structured schema to allow for analytics to be performed regardless of the underlying infrastructure. So as you said, I can look for all authentication successes, and when I look at authentication success, I'm getting Windows events, but I'm also getting API authentications. I'm getting other, and if I had a more robust environment, I might have Linux, I might have Cisco firewalls, et cetera. Everywhere someone's logging in, I'm going to get that activity, and that is so our classifications, our common events. We are developing the processing rules across, and we have a library for over 850 different systems, devices, applications that we've developed that processing for, so you don't have to. And that helps enable then our labs team to build out all the analytics scenarios that we can then go look for. And whether it's a Cisco firewall or a Palo Alto firewall, the analytics is just looking for those activities, those common descriptions of those activities. So those scenarios will work regardless of your underlying infrastructure.
Ken asks, how often are the known threats updated into logarithm?
We have the ability to update daily. Certainly threat information isn't necessarily going to update that frequently. So our three main modules, what we call our user threat detection, our network threat detection, our endpoint threat detection modules, those are updated, at least quarterly, if not more frequently than that, based on research that our labs team is doing on real threats that are in the environment. What they do is they bring in actual malware into the lab, and then they look for how does that malware actually generate log activity? What does that look like from the Windows system, from the network activity, et cetera? And then they build scenario-based rules to be able to, I close that up. Then they build out rules to help capture that scenario as it would be represented within log data, within network data. So that's their primary purpose. There's a team design around that. You had mentioned Mandiant. Actually, we have ex-Mandiant people on that team. So that gives us a pretty strong pedigree, if you will, of understanding what threats look like, and then providing that back to our customers for them to be able to leverage as is.
Yeah, you know what I'm going to do in a future webinar I do with you guys is I'm going to take like 3 events from different operating systems or whatever, show the raw event, and then show how that gets mapped to the same columns in your common event schema.
What we call our machine data intelligence. That's right. Yeah, that would be a great exercise.
Okay, let's see here. So Mark asks me, is there a way to determine login duration then? So Mark, I don't know if you were following me earlier when I was kind of describing what it takes to do that. And again, I didn't get any replies from folks about why they want this information. But if you're interested in knowing how long was the user there, you have to look at either a logon event or a logon session becoming available again event. So that's like the screensaver being dismissed and or the console being unlocked. That's when that period begins, and then it ends either when the user logs off or the screensaver kicks in or the workstation is locked or the computer is either shut down or goes into suspend mode, sleep mode. Now, I think it does. I think it does log an event associated with that logon session when the system goes into sleep mode. But maybe this is a topic for a webinar in the future. Let's see here. Beth says, how does logarithm use this information to alert? Is there any specific alarm we need to turn on to be alerted? And Beth asked that back a while ago. So could you give them some idea of can you pull up the alert rules that come out of the box so that Beth could, the extent of stuff that's already there? You don't, get your appliance and it's an empty slate. You've got a tremendous amount of stuff already built out.
Oh, assistant's being used by too many people. Actually, here I'm going to use your system really quickly. Oh, now I got to log in. Sorry, I apologize for the delay here, but we're live, and this is indicative of the fact that we are live.
We all live in your world. I want to talk to, well, Ed had to leave, but Ed was saying workstation logging is a reluctant investment. How much is risk mitigated with workstations if you've implemented PAM? I wish Ed was still here. This is such a great question. And even if you're doing privileged account management, you're doing an awesome job with privileged account management, you still want to know what's happening on your workstation. So the correlation that Ed is drawing here is, if I'm doing a great job with privileged account management, then I shouldn't have to worry that much about privileged accounts getting loose and being used on workstations. Okay, let's say that is true, all right? You still want to know what's happening on your workstations because the attacks start with someone who's not privileged. The attacks start with someone who is not privileged on some dumpy workstation out there that nobody, quote unquote, cares about. That's how the famous RSA secure ID token thing started, and it just keeps happening over and over again. Remember, Seth, it was a lowly HR rep who happened to open up a budget document or hiring plan spreadsheet, and it all began from there, and that's how secure ID tokens got compromised.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah, and you know, it's going to be the firewall that you forgot about that's in a branch office that has been updated for a while and now has a browser vulnerability because of its browser-based management. It's going to be those types of things, or like you said, a user who has been told don't open up attachments but opens up an attachment. We have someone, actually a very savvy person on our team. I think he'll be okay with me sharing this, who just hit a drive-by browser. He just went, doing research, went to a website on that was low reputation, and contracted something on his browser. Now we eat our own dog food here, so actually our CISO team, they were able to recognize that. He's very familiar with malware and with network, especially network-based malware, but he didn't recognize it on his own system. It was the CISO team monitoring it that was able to recognize it.
And weren't they? I think I heard the story. Weren't they like, dude, are you trolling us?
Yeah, they thought, exactly. But yeah, it was a legitimate ransomware malware, and we did see it trying to do its thing, and luckily we were able to, again, going back to being in a position to recognize the emerging threat before it really takes hold. We were in a position to prevent that. And one of the interesting things is he had mapped drives, and so we started to see, and it would have been devastating had that ransomware been able to go out and actually start to encrypt those mapped drives, but we were able to prevent it from being able to do so.
Great. So what are we looking at here, Seth?
So this is that knowledge base module selector, if you will. And so what this gives us the ability to do, and you can see here, if I type in compliance, there's a bunch of compliance-oriented modules. I'm going to type in threat detection. And you can see here I've got core threat detection. I also have endpoint, network, and user threat detection. When I click on those, what you're seeing is here are all the scenario-based analytics that come with that particular module. I'm just going to bring this up so you see, there's about, I think, around 50, 60, I think, analytical scenarios, built-in list, and then reports for that as well, and even saved searches. So that's just one of these modules. We always ask, our core threat detection module, this is a great module for customers just to get started. It's got a great selection of rules, and you can see here, I'm looking for lateral movement with an account sweep. I'm looking for malicious payload. You notice none of this will say Windows event X or Cisco firewall event Y. and that goes back to Randy's point that, with our categorization, our classification, our analytics doesn't need to worry about what the underlying source of information is. It just knows if I see these activities that it represents something bad in the environment. And this core threat detection module is a great module because it is relying on very common sets of data to be able to be useful for a customer.
Yeah. So let's see here. Beth, I think I just knocked out your question. If you had a question that you asked and I didn't answer it, please put it back in. I think you know how errant mouse clicks go. But otherwise, Seth, I might have derailed your presentation. We're getting close to when we should have ended by now, but we oftentimes go past the hour if people are interested. Did you nail both those features that we'd planned for you to talk about, Seth?
Yeah, we did. There's more contextual information I can show that we can pull back during the course of investigation. We have some great videos on our website or on our YouTube channel, so if you are interested in seeing more of our product in action, I definitely encourage you to check those videos out. They do a great job. We think the product does a lot to help speak for itself. So certainly check that out. And Randy and I, we love doing these webinars. We'll definitely be doing more, and certainly appreciate any opportunity we have to show off the product and help explain how customers are using it to help solve the real problems that they have.
And I'll finish up with Timothy's question. Looks like we need to be running 7.1.6 of Logarithm to get the user threat detection KB knowledge.
That may be right. 7.1.6. So our current product version is 7.2.3. So 7.1.6 is an older version. I can't remember if it's required for that or not. I just don't know quite off the top of my head. That could be right. But yeah, we certainly encourage customers to stay up to date as well as possible, just to get not just the latest knowledge-based updates, but also all the latest features and performance improvements, et cetera.
Great. Well, we'll be sending out a link to the recording and a link where you can get more information if you're interested in Logarithm. But where should people, how do they engage? Do they get a eval or talk to you guys, or how does that, what's usually the first step of engagement, Seth?
Yeah, right on our website, you can request a demo. So as I said, you can see a lot of the videos that I talked about. You can watch a product demo from here, and you can always request more information or to schedule a demo. So encourage you to go to our website to again look for the additional content if you want to see more about the product, or if you want one of our sales representatives to walk you through maybe more specifically the types of use cases you're more interested in. They would love to be able to do so.
All right, folks. We hope this was valuable to you today, and thanks again to Logarithm for making today's real training for free possible. We're signing off for now, but we'll be in touch again soon. Take care, everybody, and bye-bye.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, everyone. Bye now.